Before I do, if I could just take care of some housekeeping notes before I forget. If I could ask that you please turn off your cell phones or put them on silent, and if they go off during the talk, please do not answer them. Knowing Doha traffic and knowing the eternal and ever-present construction in Doha, some guests are likely to join us as the evening wears on. So I see that people on that side are sitting friendly enough, but there might be others, so if you could scoot closer, that would be great. A summary of tonight's talk will be on our website in about 7 to 10 days. The website is CIRS.georgetown.edu, and you can get a summary of the talk soon thereafter, in about 7 to 10 days. After Beverly's talk, there will be a Q&A session, and it'll be followed by a reception, which we hope you can join us for. And there are two coming up events I wanted to mention. A week from today at 12:45 noontime, during lunchtime, we will have an informal talk with George Osborne, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer of Britain, and he will be talking to us about contemporary politics, no doubt Brexit and other goings-on in England. I was just told that George Osborne's nickname is Gorgeous George, or one of his nicknames is Gorgeous George, and I'm sure our students are already making note of the date to come and be here for it. And then on April 11th, we will have another talk here by our own research analyst, Eslam Hassan. The talk, again at 6 p.m., will be called In Pursuit of Security and Influence, the UAE in the Red Sea and North Africa, looking at the UAE's expansive efforts across the Red Sea to acquire ports up and down Egypt, and what the UAE is doing in Djibouti and elsewhere. Promises to be quite interesting, and we hope you can join us for it. Now, the event which has brought us all here tonight and to which we've been eagerly looking forward. Let me welcome my good friend and someone whose scholarship I have long benefited from, Professor Beverly Milton-Edwards. Beverly is a visiting fellow at the Brookings Doha Center. She is also a professor of politics at Queen's University in Belfast, and she is security theme leader at the Senator George Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security, and Justice. Beverly's research focuses on security sector governance in the Middle East and the challenges of political Islam. Beverly is known for having pioneered both scholarship and practice in the field of conflict management, particularly ceasefire. From 2006 to 2010, she was the principal investigator to the European Union's civil police mission to the Palestinian territories program. She's the author of a number of books, including the one which we have the honor and pleasure of launching tonight, a book that I read, I have to brag about, before any of you had a chance to read. And I literally had to read this thick book and enjoyed every page of it, and learned immeasurably from it. Prior to this, Beverly's other books, some of her more recent books, include The Muslim Brotherhood, The Arab Spring and Its Future Face, published in 2016, Islamic Fundamentalism Since 1945, published in 2013, Jordan, A Hashemite Legacy, published in 2012, the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, A People's War, published in 2011. As you can see, she's irritatingly prolific. And last but by no means least, Hamas, the Islamic Resistance Movement in 2010. Please join me in welcoming Beverly Milton-Edwards.
Good evening, everybody, and it's such an honor and a pleasure to be here and to be a guest of CIRS at Georgetown University here in Doha, Qatar, and to give this address as we celebrate the launch of the book Contemporary Politics in the Middle East. Just as we were waiting here this evening, I was chatting with a good friend of mine, and we were talking about book launches, and I was saying, you know, I feel so spoilt here in Doha, spoilt by the hospitality and the friendliness and the wonderful catering and the prospect of catering. Imagine listening and then getting to eat afterwards. So hopefully some of the senses being fulfilled. And the reason why I'm so excited in particular is that although this is the 4th edition of this book, I never got to launch any of the earlier editions. So this is a very special moment for me. And I'd like to take this opportunity to not only give my profound thanks to Mehran for the introduction this evening, but also for the incredibly generous endorsement of this book that he wrote for me. In fact, Mehran, so generous was your endorsement that the publishers especially wrote to me when they were producing the book and typesetting the book and said, normally we just send authors, or we just let the authors see the edited highlights, but we wanted to send you the endorsement in full so that you could see for yourself. So personally, I'd really like to extend a huge thanks to you, to the colleagues at Georgetown, many of whom are here, who I consider to be great friends, and of course to my dear family at the Brookings Doha Centre, many of whom are here this evening, who throughout my time in Qatar have been hugely supportive in my research and work. And also, wow, thank you to you, the audience. Some of you, I know, have been readers and fans of the book in its earlier edition. For example, Ambassador, Your Excellency, Christian Tudor, who's here this evening, who, in fact, came and sought me out at Brookings shortly after I arrived here and informed the director, Tariq Youssef, that he needed to see me because he'd read the book. And there have been many encounters that I've enjoyed in Qatar where I've met people who've, in some way or another, engaged with the book. And really that's the point of the book. It's for people who are new to the study of the region and who are new to the topic. So the ambition is modest. It's really about understanding and helping to frame understandings of the region. So thank you. It's a pleasure for me to be in such august company, and I'm sure that we'll be able to enjoy a good old piece of, as we like to say in Northern Ireland, some good crack afterwards in the question and answer discussion. Now, unlike many of my other colleagues in academia, there's always a sense of timeliness about the politics of the Middle East. Doesn't matter what day of the week it is, what time of year it is, the Middle East is always in the headlines. Unlike my colleagues who used to work on the Soviet Union, it's not much for them to talk about these days. And unlike my colleagues who've been involved in studying the politics of the conflict in Northern Ireland, things move on. But in the Middle East, there's an eternal timeliness and pressing sense of the issues. And of course, that's one of the reasons why so many people outside the region are engaged to know. Think of the Twitter sphere. Gosh, topicality. I typed in Middle East just earlier today. Hashtag, of course, we have to talk about that when we talk about the Twitter sphere. Hashtag Trump meets Crown Prince. Hashtag Jesus was born in the Middle East. 15 years since the US-led invasion of Iraq. Morocco and Oman are the oldest allies of America in the Middle East. Jared Kushner, peace, pay. Tunisian Jewish children at school in the 1950s. Arab leaders and secret yacht summits. Israel is America's greatest ally in the Middle East. Elon Musk drinking absinthe in Israel. Richard Dawkins to bring his atheist crusade. I had to tweet back and say, surely an oxymoron. Christianity close to extinction in the Middle East. This is how the world engages with the Middle East. And in particular, we see that there's an American preoccupation with the region that we don't find if we type in Africa or Asia. Similarly, the headlines from around the region. In Algeria, they're commemorating Victory Day, recalling the sacrifices of 1.5 million glorious martyrs who fought the colonizers. In Palestine, the Fatah-dominated PA security apparatus accuses Hamas of being behind a recent bomb attack in Gaza. In Jordan, the government is imposing austerity measures, and there are protests. In Syria, the Turkish army and its allies seize control of Afrin, and of course, the news coming out of eastern Ghouta. In Lebanon, debates about forthcoming parliamentary elections and headlines of fighting corruption and calling for transparency. Libya, fears of renewed clashes between armed militia in Tripoli. I could go on. There isn't a part of the region that doesn't evince these pressing and important issues. And this is what I try to capture in the book, to frame in the book. And in the 10 chapters of the book, which cover issues of colonialism, political economy, conflict and lack of peace, ethnicity and minorities, nationalism, women, the Arab Spring. I can't remember them all. I'm sorry, I've tried memorizing them. I'm not going to talk about all 10 chapters this evening, you'll be pleased to know. But what I do want to do, I guess, is start by telling you how personal this book is for me. You know, I've spent the best part of 30 years in the Middle East as a researcher and as an academic at home in Northern Ireland, teaching courses on the politics of the Middle East to, over the years, literally thousands of students. And the book is also, I'm really proud to say, adopted on courses at prestigious universities, including, of course, Georgetown here. So I have many experiences of the region, personal experiences of the region. I've been in the region for some of the most pivotal political moments in recent times. Being caught up in events where leaders have been assassinated, where regimes have crumbled, populations have revolted, and peace, on occasion, may have looked possible. And because of those field experiences, I was, as Mehran pointed out, I was afforded the opportunity to be able to make small contributions, in particular to the management of conflict and the achievement of peace, because I do believe that the Middle East deserves peace. And that's not my speech for the Academic of the Universe contest. So not only has my research for this book been informed by extensive field work on the ground that I have conducted. Yes, I had dreams of being an ivory-towered academic, and then I'd wake up and find myself outside a falafel shop in some dusty neighborhood. So I've been informed by the extensive field work, whether in overcrowded refugee camps or presidential compounds, in the shadowy, complex lairs of rebel leaders or urban battle zones. And it's had a determining effect on how, as an academic and a lecturer, I think students should study and write about the Middle East, especially for the audience of this book, which is coming to the subject for the first time. In my experience, students of the topic feel overwhelmed. They have some knowledges, most of which are informed by popular media at home, stereotypes, mostly negative, not positive. So I'm going to talk about that in terms of how the book introduces, makes comprehensible, I think, I hope, and systemizes the politics of the region by what I call shaping themes. And I've also come to believe that the politics of the contemporary Middle East cannot be understood if it is only shaped by looking at, as other textbooks tend to do, at the state and government or on a country-by-country basis. And this is why in the years, decades, even of research that informed this book, I have spent an awful lot of time hanging with non-state, below state, disconnected and overlooked by the state actors who manifest politics with a small p and power with a small p, locally, as well as in ways that transcend the state and the geographic locales that they are situated in. The groups, the actors, the individuals that I have researched include youth activists connected across borders, virtually through social media, armed groups frequently linked through weapons transfers and common cause. If there was time, I would tell you, in fact, about the time that I was on a rooftop in the Gaza Strip with a member of one of those armed groups who handed me what I then discovered were highly explosive materials, as if it was a piece of bread or a cup of tea. I've also spent time with civil society actors, professional associations, religious groups, and women's activists and associations. So groups like Hezbollah, their leadership and their cadre in Lebanon, youth activists of the Arab Spring in Tunisia, Muslim Brotherhood leaders from Jordan, and women's rights activists from Gaza are seen in the book and through this very political lens. Of course, these groups of actors are all quite different from each other, even though they are motivated by the same or similar kinds of political or socio-economic grievances. In large swathes of this region, they also symbolize the distance between the state, the modern state, and the people. And as I've intimated, in addition to these non-state actors, I've also had the opportunity to research and interact on an important and fortunately enduring basis with state-based actors in the region, including leaders and politicians, policymakers in governments and legislatures, and government departments that run the gamut from security to welfare and social development. As a researcher, I think this gives you an insight into rivalries, resource constraints, bureaucratization, corruption, and foreign policy, and interactions of states in the Middle East with Western policymakers and politicians, as well as the all-important and increasingly emphasized security dimension. So over the decades, this has meant that my research has charted the rise and collapse of state nationalist projects, the fixation with what I call strongman politics, and the tragic consequences of states waging wars against their own populations or against other states in the region in order to distract from the problems at home. Now, one thing has really struck me when I talk to ordinary people in the region, and that is issues. Issues such as regional wealth, inequality, labour mobility and unemployment, Islamism, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and the US in the Middle East. In other words, the themes and content of this book. This is what matters to them on an everyday basis. So, when you spend years of research of such viewpoints, it is clear that the politics of the region is one of enduring, intertwining themes that I have identified as the organising chapters of this book. So, let me take an example of what I mean. Let's look at the current visit of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia to Washington and the US. On the surface, for those who perhaps have a flimsy understanding of the region, the prince arrives on his jet and goes to the White House, and there is a wonderful photo opportunity, including a great picture board which President Trump is holding, showing the billions of Saudi dollars committed to arms purchases from the US. All well and good. To the uninitiated, this is simply a diplomatic exercise. But the kinds of issues that I discuss in this book highlight the fact that MBS's visit is also connected to political issues of gender politics, and in particular, the rights of women, not just in Saudi Arabia, but elsewhere in the Middle East. The endurance of authoritarian structures of governance, proxy wars, including Syria and Yemen, the enduring consequences of the Arab Spring, political economy, US foreign policy in the Gulf, the effects of which we feel here and now in Doha, sectarianism, public sector reform debates, and the legacy. Moreover, for those who come to the subject from a Western standpoint, to understand these competing and compelling political dynamics. For example, the extent to which religion, and specifically Islam, as I discuss in chapter 5 of the book, shapes, inspires, informs in such a diverse way the politics of the region. These are important political drivers around which not only does much Western ignorance exist, but also outright prejudice. Yet these are political belief frameworks that I believe students of the topic need to be informed by to have a better understanding of the context that the majority of the population in this part of the world experience. So the book is a way, my way, of making sense of the politics of this vast, ethnically, politically, religiously, and socio-economically diverse region. And one of the main points I make in this book is that the politics of the contemporary Middle East is not as exceptional as many in the West would have us believe. So unlike some of my esteemed colleagues at Brookings, I discount the claim that the Middle East is quite so exceptional. Now, you may be wondering what I mean by that. Aren't we always being told that the inhabitants of the region are different from us in the West and the so-called civilizational values that shape our political mores and norms? Of course we are. This is what we're always being told, that they are different from us. So let me give you an example to illustrate what I mean. And the example is, as I discuss in the book, populism and leadership. Authors of many texts on the Middle East constantly opine that the region is characterized by populist states led by people with scant regard for human rights and rule of law norms. Yet, in the last 5 years, in the US, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and Russia, we see evidence of exactly the same kinds of populist politics and leadership styles that make the so-called Middle Eastern disposition look not so exceptional after all. Of course, it's a pity that this is an issue that is about a race to the political bottom, but I still think the point is well made. The democracy status of the West is also going into decline. And as I argue in chapter 6 of the book, the Middle East remains largely static, and leaders of the region are no longer even compelled to pay lip service to the promotion of such values. So my argument throughout the book is that the Middle East is not as unique or exceptional, especially with respect to these enduring crass frames of the region with which large parts of Western popular media apply to it. Like many other regions of the globe, including Africa, Asia, and increasingly the West, the politics of the Middle East exhibits the effects of, for example, the lasting effects and the lasting legacy of colonialism, power relations, lack of political participation or apathy, poor economic growth, increasing urbanization, and a return to faith and faith-based discourses. Of course, there are regional outliers and extremes, and I do acknowledge them in the book. Nevertheless, in theory and in practice, the contemporary politics of the region is driven, I argue, by the same broad dynamics of change over the last century as elsewhere across the globe. Of course, I'm generalizing, but I hope you'll bear with me. I also argue that for the foreseeable future, the politics of the region, within the region, and between the people and the state, as well as by the region and other parts of the globe, will stay animated in one way or another, to one degree or another, by these same issues. Let me address one such issue: youth. In 2017, in the UK, following a hastily called general election by Prime Minister Theresa May, the youth factor was identified as central to the emergence of new forms of political mobilization and campaigning in the UK, especially on social media. Weeks ago, in the United States of America, it was youth, Parkland students, who have begun to challenge the unchallengeable, the power of the gun lobby in the US. And as I demonstrate in chapter 10 of the book, youth in the region represent a powerful intersectionality of class, gender, nationality, and faith, as evidenced indeed by the role played by youth in the Arab Spring. The same grievances are levied, the same challenge to authority and dismissal of obsolete and out-of-touch political structures, the same intergenerational struggles. And I'm smiling here because Mehran and I were talking about intergenerational struggles, being parents of teenage children. Of course, before I get ahead of myself, it's important to note that some of the arguments in the book are open to challenge, especially in the current climate. The ways in which the West talk about the Middle East has become, despite the knowledge effects of social media, narrow and increasingly hostile. So in some respects, there are case studies in the book that such elements can employ to further their hostility and calls for securitizing practices including Arab or Muslim bans, and a continuing categorization of the region employing time-worn tropes of terrorism and barbarity. So I want to be clear here. In contemporary politics of the Middle East, and in particular through the case studies, I'm not setting out to reinforce bias, but I do acknowledge it exists. And one reason why I acknowledge it exists is that over the years, when I've interacted with the students on the module that I teach, we've had to have a very honest conversation about prejudice and bias. Now, I have to admit that one reason why we had to have that conversation was because we ourselves in Northern Ireland, over the years, lived in a society where prejudice and bias played a very big part in a sectarian, political, socio and economic conflict that was called the Troubles. So maybe that's why we feel we really have an obligation, as students of any topic, but in particular the Middle East, to address bias and prejudice. So I acknowledge that it exists. I'm simply trying to use research in the book on how it is, to give students the tool to create their own understandings. So in that respect, the pedagogic claim of the book is small. I'm not attempting to change the world one student at a time. But I feel that the book is a resource that can be used, can open up the opportunities for looking at the region in other ways. This is because, as each chapter, theme, and case study illustrates, the context does actually matter and shapes the issue under scrutiny. For example, Chapter 8 on ethnicity and minorities has case studies on Palestinian Arabs in Israel, on the Alawites in Syria, and the Yazidis in Iraq. And this demonstrates this. The issue is the same in the book. Minority and ethnic politics has, since the end of the Cold War, become an important driver in the region. The political outworkings of such, however, depending on context, can run the gamut of power holding, for example, the Alawites in Syria, that alters the balance of power, even in the wider region, to being victims of genocide and ethnic cleansing, such as the Yazidis of Iraq. So the local context of the theme really matters, and so does the history. And for this reason, the book goes back in history, and in particular to the colonial period. And this is because the colonial powers, especially Britain and France, were responsible for some of the founding moments of the contemporary Middle East, as I discussed in Chapter 1. They invented the modern Middle East, creating new states at the stroke of a pen. Actually, they didn't go like this, they tended to go like this. And then we always make this joke about somebody got their elbow nudged if you look at some of the little points of difference. They created new states at the stroke of a pen on maps in Whitehall. And more than that, this period of grand interference and influence, which of course in the Gulf here was experienced till 1971, endowed the region with systems of governance, constitutional dispositions or frames, enduring conflicts, including the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, economic dependencies, dominant linguistic and cultural elite preferences, and power relations that endure to the present day in form and content, as well as in reaction in the messages of grievances from below. So, for so many political constituencies in the Middle East, that past is still very much present. And affects their lives, especially in terms of what I call everyday insecurities. And I know that that past is very much present. Let me share an anecdote with you. I know the past is very much present because Balfour, the man who came up with the Balfour Declaration that accepted the premise of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, is very much alive and well in the back of many a taxi that I've taken across the Arab region. You get in the taxi and you're asked where you're from. And if you say that you're British, Balfour. Balfour. The past is always present. Doesn't matter where you are, it's there. Let me take another, perhaps controversial issue that the book deals with and that we might discuss further. And this is the issue of violence. In the West, we've become habituated, particularly when we look at mainstream and popular and social media, to hearing the Middle East described as the crucible of modern-day violence and terrorism. So the way I've responded to this in the book is probably a bit unorthodox. If you look in the index of the book, which I hope you all do, so this is where I'm going to do my commercial plug. So if you look in the index of the book, which I hope you all do, and you've got the flyer there with the discount, which brings the cost down to a mere $15, which apparently is the equivalent of purchasing 5 cups of coffee in the Georgetown cafeteria. If you look in the index, it has to be a bargain. Come on now. It has to be a bargain. Think of the gifting. Think of the pleasure on other people's faces as you give them this book. If you look in the index of the book, you will see, if you look under T and you look for terrorism, and you look under V and you look for violence, you won't find anything. I wrote a book about the contemporary politics of the Middle East, and I don't have violence and terrorism. Well, I do. But what I do is debate and lay out issues about violence and terrorism in chapters on conflict and lack of peace, on colonial rule, on nationalism, on political Islam, and political economy, and so on. This is because I don't just believe, I know that my research over the years has demonstrated this, that the conditions explain such violence and terrorism as a reaction to the politics of authoritarianism, ethnic domination, rights denied, and freedoms reneged on. This is what truly explains the phenomenon of terrorism and violence in the Middle East. The last factor I will mention, you'll be pleased to know the end is in sight, is where we are today and where we go from here. And indeed, the final chapter of the book is entitled The Arab Spring and the New Era of Uncertainty. Now, I have to admit something here. I've been somewhat of a thief, because the era of uncertainty was not a phrase that I coined myself, but my dear colleague and director of the Brookings Doha Centre over the past 18 months, as we've frequently sat in meetings with policymakers and other researchers and academics, as a way of bringing the discussion to an end, looping everything in, has said, it's an era of uncertainty. And fortunately for me, because he didn't copyright the phrase, I've stolen it for myself. So I say in the book, and I'm going to just quote here by way of ending, the future of the region is almost impossible to predict. Many of the issues outlined in this book, such as political economy, political Islam, the state and its rulers, will probably continue to determine the political systems which will develop over the next decade, not least of which will be the unfolding legacy of the Arab Spring, the resilience of authoritarian regimes. They will continue to be tested and challenged by the region's citizens. And if I could rewrite that center, I would put youth. The previous notion of enduring authoritarianism as key to the stability of the region has been partly debunked. New political systems and dispensations will be shaped by a number of factors, including historic legacy and tradition, elite constellations, economic development, the role of the military in the state, regional and external interests, and perhaps, more meaningfully, for the first time, the preferences of a truly enfranchised citizenry. So that's where I'll end. And thank you very much indeed for your kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for this wonderful, wonderful presentation, and you've really given us a lot to think about. Do read the book. It is an absolutely fantastic book. It's an easy read. It can be read at multiple levels, whether you're a newcomer to the region or an expert. You can get multiple and different things from it, and I seriously recommend it. Thank you, Beverly, and my thanks to you. Thank you very much.